Welcome to Parallax. I'm your host, Tom Amarque. With me today are Zak Stein, Marc Gafni, and Alexander Barth. Zak is a philosopher, author of Education in a Time Between Worlds. That's a term that is now on everybody's mind, and a contributor to the Consilience Project. Marc is an author, philosopher, a spiritual teacher. His works revolve around Eros, the unique self, and digital intimacy. And Alexander doesn't really need an introduction. His last book, Digital Libido, revolves around sex, power, and violence in the network society, attentionism, syntheos, and the Infinite Noun. So the idea here is to bring all these different kinds of ideas together and see if we can learn something new about well-being in the world in the time of transition we are all finding ourselves in right now. And so we're having 90 minutes of conversation followed by 30 minutes of a Q&A. So if anybody has some questions, just put them in the chat box and we will deal with them later. So let's just start easy so that we're all on the same page. Eros and Libido, what's that and where's the difference? Go.
Marc, you want to start?
Sure.
Eros first.
Eros first. So, it's great to be here. And
well, welcome. Yes, welcome.
Yeah, welcome everyone. And I think Eros is really about welcome, right? In other words, there's basically a fundamental question: are we welcome in the cosmos? Right? Is there a welcome home sign in the cosmos? And in the intimate universe, which is also about Eros. Right, it's always available right now. So it's not by accident that we started with the question of, and Tommy just said, "Oh, welcome," right? But that afterthought of welcome is actually everything. In other words, is welcome an afterthought, or is welcome, right, the essential, right, experience, right, that we can find, right, at any and every moment? And so even when, most of my relatives walked to the gas chambers, they still had in those moments an experience of being welcome in cosmos, right? That there's a way to be in Eros, even in hell, right? So when we talk about Eros, we're not talking about a Pollyannish Eros. We're not talking about allurement without autonomy. We're not talking about attraction without repulsion. We're talking about what Zak and I call a cosmo-erotic humanism. And I remember the day we were in the basement with Barbara Marx Hubbard and Christina Kincaid, and we were looking for the name. And I had written earlier in life some volumes, right? We all have a common sin. Zak and Alexander and I, we write too much, right? So I'd written some volumes on radical Kabbalah, where I talked about a cosmic humanism, and we were thinking about this notion of a culture of Eros. And what would it mean to create a politics of Eros, a culture of Eros? And we came up with the term of cosmoerotic humanism, and it drove people like Alexander to drink immediately, right? It just had that immediate impact. But Eros means the experience of intrinsic value in cosmos. And let me just offer a kind of Eros equation so we can just kind of work with the word. So Eros equals, and I'm going to give kind of the becoming and the being side of equation, because Eros has qualities in being, if you will, if I can borrow Whitehead's phrase, and has qualities of becoming. Whitehead is, of course, articulating a basic idea in the wisdom streams. We call it in Kabbalah yesh and ayin, right? So Eros is the experience of being, which expresses itself as radical aliveness, right? Eros equals radical aliveness, seeking, moving towards, desiring ever deeper contact and ever greater wholeness. Right? There's a vector of Eros, right, in reality, but that Eros expresses an intrinsic value, right? That reality inhabits intrinsic value, but not value in the old Plato sense, right? Not the myth of the given, right? Zak and I talk about an evolving value, right? And I think Alexander, I'm sure there's distinctions, and I look forward to the distinctions, but there's a place where I feel there's a kind of overlap, kind of between us, right? Which is this notion, Nikos Kazantzakis once wrote, "We are the saviors of God," which is not a bad summation of all of Luria in the 16th century, right? In other words, that actually God is becoming, God is both being and becoming, right? And value is intrinsic and value is evolving, right? And value emerges from eternity, but not in the sense of a purely preordained eternity, but more like the way Wittgenstein talks about eternity, which is remarkably similar, right, to how the interior sciences do of the great traditions, right? Eternity is not lots of time, that's a lot of time. Eternity is that which inheres beneath time, right? It's the timeless time, the placeless place, right? It's that which is immeasurable, right? That which can't be quantified, that which is priceless, which we can all access in our own interiors, right? So Eros is the quality of cosmos, which is value itself, which lives from the first nanoseconds of the Big Bang all the way up. One of the fellows at the center, who's a dear friend of mine and Barbara Marx Hubbard, and has been interacting with Zak and I, is Howard Bloom, who's a kind of the resident guru of NASA, right? He hangs out with NASA and he does kind of science, and so we've been dialoguing with Howard every other week for like 5 years, right? And we spend most of our time in science, right? In that realm. So one of the things that Howard, Zak, and I have kind of penned an essay that hasn't yet. We're doing the stages of integration and formulation, but the basic notion is that in this conversational cosmos that we live in, right, the structures of meaning are all the way up and all the way down, right? And as meaning evolves, there's matter, life, and mind. There's stages of matter, life, and mind. There are obvious discontinuities between matter, life, and mind. There is, if you will, a kind of punctuated equilibrium, if we can borrow that term, not in a formal technical way, but in a sense of momentous leaps. We move from matter to life to mind. So there's clearly discontinuities, but there's also continuities. There's a thread in cosmos, right? There's a plot line to cosmos. There's a storyline, and we're both participants in creating that storyline, right? And, right, we operate within it, and it operates and acts on us. So there are inherent evolving values of cosmos, right? A kind of evolving perennialism, if you will. And of course, that term seems paradoxical. I was talking to a kind of the leading light in one particular academic field in America about 6 weeks ago. And Zak and I talked right afterwards, and I talked to him about evolving perennialism, and he almost like turned the Zoom off. You can't have evolving perennialism. Point of perennialism is that it's not evolving. Isn't that what perennial means? No, it's not, right? There's eternity and evolution, and they're dialectically related, and there's a larger truth, right? We have an evolving set of values, and that's what Eros is. Eros is that which animates, suffuses, drives, right, this emergent value. Is Eros God? God's a complicated term, right? The God you don't believe in doesn't exist, right? We all have a God we don't believe in that doesn't exist, right? So let's watch out. But Eros is the evolving force of presence, of being and becoming, that manifests as value, that transmutes, that evolves, that's part of a thread of continuity, even as Eros emerges, right, with radical discontinuities. So in that sense, right, Eros is emergentism, if I can borrow a word, right? Eros is, right? Eros is, right? And of course, it's emergent, right? Eros is emergent, right? It's an evolving value. And maybe I'll finish with this, just so we can kind of have just breaks of time. Right? So this is a good place, I think, to finish. One of my teachers, and teacher is also a paradoxical idea. What does it mean to have a teacher, right? And that itself is that's frightening. But actually, teachers are important. Realization's important, and transmission of realizations happens in so many different ways. So one of my teachers, and all of my teachers, by the way, died before I was born, which gives you a little more latitude, right? But one of them is Abraham Cook, and he writes something very, very beautiful about divinity, or about Eros, if you will. He says, divinity, Eros, is perfect, and at the same time is always perfecting. for perfection, which is always perfecting, is so much more perfect than perfection that is stagnantly perfect. And so that's perhaps a beginning of the conversation. It's delightful to be here. Welcome, everyone. We're welcome. Ciao.
Perfect, Mark. Alexander, you want to jump in?
Yes. I'm glad you're having conversations with Howard Bloom on a regular basis, because I think I'm going to be a Howard Bloom of this conversation, be a lot darker and moodier than you are, Mark. I understand the ideas, and it's not that they haven't been there. I mean, I see traces of Taoism. I see traces of Gilles Deleuze's form of vitalism in your thinking. But the problem is that the Eros you're describing does not exist. It just isn't there. It's wishful thinking. And what I mean by that is that instead of going for the cosmic here and trying to find the human in the cosmic instantly, which is actually against emergentism, because you're then trying to make a certain principle for a certain emergence or a certain emergence vector, a general principle for all emergence vectors. And that's not emergentism at all. That's universalism. That's believing that there is a God before anything else. The God has pre-programmed the universe. That's why there are no general emergentist principles at all. Proper emergentism is that if something happens that is genuinely novel in the history of the universe, it needs to be treated as its own phenomenon. And whatever habits it has needs to be treated as its own loss and is understood as its own system. That's what emergentism teaches. So there's a difference there. But I want to go back to is where I want to start from, and where the concept of libido comes in as a contrast to Eros, is that we think in our work, Zak and I, that human beings are incredibly tribal, and everything we do is tribal. So I want to shrink your perspective here, down from the cosmic down to the tribal. And therefore, all stories human beings tell about themselves relate to tribal constructs. Everything we invent, everything that we encounter is tribal poietic. Tribal poiesis means that everything we encounter is something that's born out of the tribe for the need of the tribe. Ethics, therefore, has to be what is a constructive mindset in this tribe's interests versus what would be destructive mindset in the interest of the tribe. And that's, for me, it's a Zoroastrian. I'm not Jewish, I'm Zoroastrian. Means Asha and Druj. These are the only principles that really mean anything to human society. And I think it's really dangerous to try to stretch what is good for your tribe into universal principles that these principles will come out of cosmos. And this is where I disagree. What we've done then instead in our work, we work with the term libido, is that we bring Eros back to where the Greeks put it. The Greeks regarded Eros as one of several different forms of love. It's really the love of sexual attraction. There's also the philia, which is the mental attraction between human beings. And there's also the possibility of agape. And agape is the divine love with the transcendent love, that which transcends you and whoever you share it with. And then we have in our work towards an understanding of ecstatic experience as the foundation for religion. Please note here that Zak and I in our work are staying within the tribe at all times. We do not try to find explanations for human behavior or human desire or human thinking outside of a tribal context, because we think that's why we lose it completely. And by staying inside the tribal context, that means that the tribe is held together by Eros, sexual attraction. The tribe is held together by philia, mental love, even more so. And the tribe is also ultimately on a more shamanic state or more advanced state, held together by the possibility of reaching agape or reaching ecstatic experiences, what we call the infinite now in our work. And then instead of going towards some kind of cosmic explanation, we go towards tribal explanations in our philosophy. The tribal explanation here is the beauty is that we all wanted to die when we were born. The first instant reaction when we were born is that we wanted to go back into the womb and not exist as independent entities at all, which is death, really. We couldn't die. Therefore, an old woman, a matriarch, the midwife, greets her with a smile and says, "Welcome to the world." And that transfers the original libido into a libido. And the possibility to be human, stay alive, wanting to live, wanting to express yourself through love and life and art, whatever, and to be a constructive and creative person, is the possibility to stay within the libido, to stay within the denial that you really want to die. So I would argue as we go forward, Mark, and I want to hear what Zak has to say about this too, is that I would argue that we need to go into here is that what I'm lacking in your philosophy, Mark, is Hegel. I'm lacking in fundamental understanding what death is. and understanding death as the absolute, and that nothing has meaning if it wasn't in relation to death. And meaning is not something that evolves over throughout history, because the universe itself does not have a direction. The universe is contingent. The universe could implode at any time. The universe will not give us any values at all. The only values we could ever have will come from inside the tribe and our own role to contribute to the tribe. Those are the only values you can have as a human being. And anything that goes outside of that, I think, is probably just wishful thinking, but isn't based in reality. And I want to go back to this idea that if libido is an alternative to Eros, it's not a cosmic force at all. Libido is just a very, very functioning form of denial of the motido. And this is Freud, right? So this is like, motido is the death drive, but because we are capable of denying that we want to die, we can assure ourselves that we want to live. And that capacity to be alive until the moment we really die, and we have to submit to death, is what life is.
Zach?
What's your point of view on that, Zachary?
Before I take out my sword, you go first.
It's interesting. This is where I thought this conversation would go. A few things I'll say. One is that I think there's differences in language here that make this a harder conversation than it needs to be, but then there are also very difficult actual deep conceptual issues. And a couple of things that Alexander said that surprised me. Actually, I didn't realize Alexander's view in this respect. And so I'll say a couple of things. My immediate response to what you said, Alexander, would be like, well, that's just what your tribe thinks. And your tribe's making universal statements about all the other tribes, right? And so I'm curious how to get out of that performative contradiction of reducing it back to the tribal as descriptive, which is to say, if we don't search for a universal explanation, then we can't describe all humans as being in tribes, because that's a universal explanation of humans as all being tribal. And so there's a kind of crypto normativism in the claim that's made about the reducing it all to the tribe. So I think that's I'm sure you have a way out of that, but that's the first thing that occurred to me, which is that, that sounds remarkably relativistic for someone who I don't believe is that way. So I think there was like a constellating of a polarity there against Marx's sweeping universalism, that you kind of went to a more radical articulation of something that sounded quite relativistic to me, which isn't a feasible position to take given the situation that we're in currently, where we're dealing with existential threats that have to do with precisely the kind of tribalism that you're describing. So the overcoming of the tribal, and the question of what are the languages spoken by the shamanic caste that moderates between tribes. And so that's one thing I'll say. And then the other thing I'll say, and this will piss Alexander off even more, is that my research in human development, cognitive development, shows really well that meaning does evolve, which is to say that at least in the context of when you're looking at human beings, the difference between the meaning-making system, let's say, of a 4-year-old and the meaning-making system of a 16-year-old and the meaning-making system of a 40-year-old are very different. And there are threads of continuity between those developmental levels. And so you have these clusters of semantic and meaningful actions and words that just evolve. And maybe evolve is not the right word, but they mutate and adapt relative to the environmental demands made on the organism, and deepen along a common thread of articulation. Kohlberg's work in moral development is probably the greatest example of this, but there's dozens of other examples of those kinds of continuity. And so, yeah, then I guess the final question would be, when I look out here and there's this pond and there are these ducks, that they're definitely going to mate. These ducks are going to fuck, and they're waddling around there. And so the question is like, isn't there continuity between the animal world and the human world? Which is to say that even if you want to remain non-universalistic and non-transcendental and stay emergent, don't we need to speak about the continuities between the human world and the animal world, at least, if not the human world and the animal world and the biological world and the material world? That there's an overarching story that can be told, and if we don't tell it, what does that mean about the state of our culture? Because these are the stories that we've always told. We've always tried to explain the fullness of the position of the human in the cosmos. So again, back to the welcome sign in the universe, right? Is the ducks having sex over there telling me something about the cosmos or not? So I think that's the one thing I'll say. I think the other thing is that, one of the threads, as I've always understood it in depth psychology and psychoanalysis, was precisely the impersonalization of the libidinal energy, right? Which is that the libido is not mine, right? That the unconscious is not mine. That there is a broader field of energy that the human organism participates in that actually explains our behavior a little bit better than other things. So I think there's a common goal between these two systems to try to find a way to understand the kind of root human energy systems as related to broader phenomenon, fundamentally, that gets me out of Zak and into some other way of relating to the human experience. And I think that's a common thread. I'll let Mark speak to death, because this is a fundamental aspect of what we're trying to work on, is the human coping with death, and the inescapable coping with death, and specifically the new human coping with species level extinction, which is creating a new type of relationship to death that we must process psychologically. Okay. So I'll leave it at that. It was not the most. It was hard to respond to all of that you guys said. So
before Mark, thank you, Zak. Before you go on, what I think that your concept of Eros also encompasses is a form of evolution, right? And so what I feel, what I understand from your concept of Eros is very similar to what Schopenhauer describes as will, as this unspecified form through which we make sense, through the tribe, and through meaning-making processes in the tribe. And I don't think there's too much. The problem isn't that deep, actually. Is that do I get that right?
Well, let's in general, right? So Tom, I totally appreciate that impulse. In general, although I happen to love Schopenhauer, but I'm not willing to take on his defense here, right, in that conversation, because that's a more complex thing. And so I'd rather kind of stay with the term Eros, not reduce it to another term of another thinker, and kind of invest it with new meaning, right, as we go, with permission, and kind of,
sure.
If that's okay. But there's no question that there's a concept of will. So the notion of will that you introduced is very, very important. There's a very beautiful phrase in Hebrew, which is ratzon, R-A-T-Z-O-N, if I can spell it in English, which comes from the Song of Solomon. In the first chapter, it says, Mashcheni acharecha narutza, draw me after you. Narutza, I will run towards you, which is back to Zak's ducks, right? I will run towards you. That is to say, right, I give up this sense of lower will, and I'm moved by this larger current of will. So ratzon, right, this notion of will, right, is enormously important. And can I actually access the will of cosmos, right, individuated in me, what we would call a unique self? Can I actually achieve an ontic identity of wills, Right? So thank you for introducing the term.
Yeah,
right?
well,
And
that's a Schopenhauer conception.
Right. Well, Schopenhauer is using. That's why I'm being careful. I'm picking up with intention. Right. I spent a lot of time on Schopenhauer in my early 20s, so I'm with intention picking up on your word will, but not adopting Schopenhauer because that would create too much baggage for a number of reasons right now. But I'm going to just pick up and honor the word will itself in the way we associate to it as a first word, if you will, and a first value that we can all kind of intuitively pick up and say that will is a very, very important idea. And actually in Radical Kabbalah, the onic identity of wills and the individuated will, or if I'd say it differently, the realization that my deepest heart's desire, when it's clarified, right, participates in evolutionary desire, right? It's a very important set of ideas. So I want to just bow and honor that. And then with permission, is that okay to turn back to?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So will is on the table, and we've bracketed Schopenhauer for a moment, anyways. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Alexander, and thank you, Zach. I just want to say a couple of, kind of introductory things, and then respond, Alexander, to a couple of things that you said, but first, just want to say I'm just delighted to be talking, right? And I just want to, but that delight is also a part of our philosophy. In other words, what we share here is, and you said, your concept is great, but it's just not true. So I kind of had the same feeling as you finished talking. That was really fantastic. Isn't it a shame that it's all wrong? Right? But, in other words, so we had a similar response, right? In other words, so we are, and we're going to look for, I hope, the places where we meet, but we're also not afraid of the places where we distinguish, right? And obviously I have great honor for you. We met and spoke, early on, right? And every time you write big love when you sign an email, right? I feel big love coming at me, right? And oh my God, and you look like Santa Claus, so what's bad? Right? You know what I mean? So we're all good all the way through. But actually, the delight of this conversation is, I think, something which discloses intrinsic value, right? So I want to just kind of go direct. Kind of to a direct access, right? Let's just access and that direct experience of value is not phenomena, it's noumena, right? In other words, it's ability, right, to actually directly access, this matters, right? This conversation matters, right? And I can feel that in the presence of this space, and I would intuit respectfully that everyone can feel it. Oh, these guys are serious. This conversation matters. There's value here on the table. This is important, right? This is not, performative, in the negative sense of it, right? It's this very important, sincere. There's a, Lionel Trilling's phrase. There's a sincerity on the table here, and even if I can, with a lot of love, invoke a phrase, there's a purity. There's a purity in the conversation, and those are all important words. And we have a kind of devotional relationship to, can we clarify here? So we're not interested in scoring points. We're interested in, can we come out wiser and clarify, not just for our own entertainment, not just because, wow, we did a little wisdotainment today, fun way to spend a day. Oh, I spoke to Daniel last night, spoke to Alexander today. We're kind of wisdotaining through the world, but actually this has intrinsic value to it, and it's a value that's needed, right? And that we need to be doing this, and we need to be clarifying this. And that notion of intrinsic value, right, is exactly, right, the kind of thing that needs to be explicated. Zach invoked the term cryptonormative, which is a term that we like. And so let's give you an example. We talk a lot about techno-feudalism, and we're about to put out a book on techno-feudalism, which is not unrelated to I don't want to make sure I pronounce it right, Alexander, netocracy. Okay, so those are very related strains, and a conversation just about that actually would be enormously valuable and fructifying. I just wanted to use the word fructifying, but right, in other words, that's an important conversation. We can have that, but one of the things in the critiques, right, of what Zach and I are calling techno-feudalism. So the book Reengineering Humanity out of Cambridge University Press 2018, or Zuboff's book that kind of got a lot of play, Shoshana Zuboff's book, right? So throughout that book, the entire book's cryptonormative. In other words, Shoshana Zuboff is kind of down the hall from Pinker, at Harvard, right? She was formed by by kind of worldview, although not nearly as interesting and beautiful as you articulated, because you're interesting and beautiful. She was formed by more boring versions of it, but she was essentially formed by this, notion that you can't establish any intrinsic value, right? She was deep in the kind of Marxist postmodern, moment that deconstructed all values and ignored the performative contradiction that Zak was referring to. And yet the entire book, actually, whenever she actually gets to actually talk about value, you actually realize there's no difference between her and what Zak and I are calling the techno-feudalists, that they actually both agree that there's no value, paradoxically, and she refuses to admit it, right? And so she'll make a crypto-normative move, and she'll, let's say, cite Sartre, and Being and Nothingness, page 551. Let's talk about the value of first-person voice, but actually, if you read Sartre there, right, on page 551, actually what Sartre means is there is no intrinsic value, and she's actually hijacking Sartre to make a crypto-normative point because she's actually trying to appeal to a kind of Platonism that actually we reject. And I think that's where you, Zak, and I, we share something. We reject a kind of myth of the given Platonism. And I think that's an important common space that I want to honor, although we go in very different ways in it. We get from that rejection to a re-embrace of value, right? Right, a re-embrace of value, right, as an intrinsic evolving value. And I'm going to get to death in a second. Right? But just hold on, stay in life just for another second before we get to death, right? So we re-embrace value. And when you read Pinker, right? Pinker is fundamentally intellectually dishonest. And in that he's, right, and he's beautiful in all the ways that he's beautiful. I mean, Pinker made a real contribution, which I honor, even though I think he's way off base on 10 major points. But the point is he's massively cryptonormative, meaning he refuses to declare value, even though on every third page, he's making an assertion that's cryptonormative that only makes sense in terms of some intrinsic field of value. So there's this cryptonormative move that's going on, right, which is saying, all right, right, and clearly, and if I can speak, personally, although you and I haven't, we've never drunk enough wine together, and hopefully we'll get to do that, but clearly you're passionately, I noticed, I didn't miss that. I'm enlightened, so I don't drink Diet Coke, but, every once in a while it kind of comes on, right? But you're passionately committed to value. You're filled with passion, right? It's a delight to meet, right? Passion, right? And we both go into darkness, and we both go into passion. I try and live between the pre-tragic, the tragic, and the post-tragic, right? And so I'm not in any way Pollyannish, right? I've buried more students than you can imagine who are 18, right? I know the face of death well. I pray for my children every day who are both, fighters. They're both commandos, right? Who've killed people, right? So I know death very, very closely, right? And so, and Leonard Cohen's, We Want It Darker, right? Resonates well, and that's what he played right before he died, right? So darkness is real, and I go to post-tragic, right? Because I actually know in this moment, I don't need any fucking philosophy, just by sitting with Zak, right? And Alexander and Tom, and the feeling of value between us, and the significance of this intersubjective space, right? And if I may, and the big love that you sign your letters with, and the outrageous love that I sign my letters with, which are not completely unrelated. So my experience, if I can be super personal, because this is personal in the best sense of the word, the most beautiful sense of the word, right? I feel this cryptonormativity, and you remind me. And you can, of course, you'll get the last word. You can tell me what I remind you of, right? But for now I'm talking, right? So you remind me of a beautiful passage in Abraham Cook, right? One of his unpublished passages that they edited, the family, and they didn't get out. He says, "Yesh kfira she'emunah ve'emunah she'kfira," right? There's heresy, which is faith, and faith, which is heresy, right? And it's very beautiful. Right, and I feel in you this heretic who's filled with faith, but I don't mean faith in Platonic ideals. I don't mean faith of a pre-tragic way, right? I don't mean faith in in inappropriate constructions which actually move us to avoid our true situation, but actually a faith in the sense of the Hebrew word trust, emunah, trust that this is all intrinsically good. Right, that this matters, that this conversation matters, that it ultimately all matters, right? And that ultimately all matters is what we mean by Eros, right? It's why it's a cosmorotic humanism, right? It affirms the intrinsic fucking dignity of human life, even in the face of death. So let me just say one thing about death and then to you. Or if you'd like, I can pause here and come back to death. Right? Is it one more? Up to you.
I can break in because I'd love to come.
Breaking because I talked for too long and I want to also not.
And there's so many balls in the air right now.
So many balls in the air, right? So we'll get back to death. Okay, go, brother.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, no, my values are not coming from my tribe at all, Zach. So just like you're a cognitive scientist and a lot of your philosophical work is based on data, whatever data is available, the same thing goes for me. I'm a deep anthropologist. I work with anthropology all the time. I work with data research. I'm a big defender of the value of the family. The classic family size is 40 people, not the stupid sort of nuclear families we try to force onto people today. I believe in large families. I believe in clans. Clans are 157 people to be exact, the Dunbar number. We feel totally aligned with people of that size. And then we go up to the tribal size between 1,200 and 1,500 people. These are universal forms, not because they were invented by God and stole them. They're in universal forms simply because Darwin's evolution worked that way. And we all have a common heritage only 40,000 years ago. And human beings are the same across the planet because of that shared heritage. That's why we're so alike. We killed all other hominids to be even more alike, to be honest about it. So Darwin's evolution is the narrative. The tribe here is the unit we can work with that we can trust. So I'm looking for paradigmatic values. The value systems that we work with is called paradigmatics, meaning that there are certainly some eternal values for humans that always last, like loving your family, loving your clan, and working for your tribe and defending it. Right? These are values that stay over time, at least for the last 40,000 years. They're always valuable. But then those are the paradigmatic values, meaning that if we live in a completely different society all of a sudden, written language create a different society, printed language create a different society, and the latest revolution is the interactive language coming out of California since the 1980s. That's now transforming the world completely. That's exactly why your work, Zach, is important, because you work with the values in between worlds. You work with paradigmatics. You discuss what were the values of the previous system that no longer are valid. And therefore, there must be new values installed that are specific for the new paradigm. What can we learn from the new technologies we use, from the new environments we're in? I'm very Aristotelian. I hate Plato. I'm very Aristotelian. The context we live in. What can we get out of that? What would be a winner's solution to this? What would be aristocratic? What would be proletarian? What would be noble in the society? Or those kind of values. And that's exactly where you, Zach, are working. So that's where we're aligned. And that's what we call paradigmatics. So yes, we agree on values and the importance of values, but we have to remember this first thing, again, going back to the motivo-libido difference, that the priesthood, the real priesthood, like in Judaism and Zoroastrianism, I'm not a big fan of Christianity and Islam. You should know that, because I don't believe in transparency at all. I believe in a priesthood that actually, where a priesthood seeks truth no matter what. And then the priesthood speaks to the people, what the people need to hear. There's a difference between logos and mythos, meaning the story we should tell people is a story how they will still love their children. That's a fundamental value. That's a mythical value, because the real logos that the priests know about is that there are no values at all. The world is a contingent chaos. We just happen to be here. We just happen to be here. And therefore, returning to the tribe and going to tribal poiesis is where we build values from. Then what I do right now with Söderqvist is that, of course, I take the responsibility for us living in a global world today, globalized society. I wrote a book called The Global Empire in 2003. I work with these issues all along. And then I discovered that was during the Bronze Age, the Persians developed empire as concept, and then fostered the Jews, the Hebrews, to invent nationhood. The Jews are therefore still the most successful form of nationalism, as Hegel was very adamant about, because they marriage nation and religion into one, which is fantastic. That's the Judaism's heritage that they provided to us that we can get inspiration from. And what I'm interested in is that once we have larger populations and permanent settlements, and we human beings have not changed at all, we're the same human beings who were 10,000 years ago, we have not developed, but technologies around us have developed and fooled us into believing that we have evolved. No, we have not evolved at all. Technology has developed, religion has gone the other way. Religion probably peaked during the Bronze Age, and there's a terrible version of religion today with stuff like Scientology and Jehovah's Witnesses and all kind of crap around there. And if you're going to go to another planet to live with Tom Cruise forever, that's the worst form of religion you could ever have. Religion has gone downhill in the last 5,000 years. But technology has fooled us into believing that technological advancement is also human advancement. It isn't. It just made our lives easier. but we're still confronted with the same existential issues where we both have to work with the timeless aspect of values, loving your family, and the time-specific values that you, Zak, are working with in your education between worlds. What do we really teach our kids today? And is that what they need? That's a perfect example of paradigmatic values. So I work with those. I work with empire. I work with nation. And I'm interested in how do you keep many tribes together without them killing each other? And this is the fundamental aspect of priesthood at all times. The fundamental aspect of priesthood is to try to fool the people into believing that a peace that is prolonged is beneficial to all of them, to try to avoid war. That's essentially what priests do or should do in religion. And that's where I work from. That's my philosophy. So I'll pass it on to you guys and see if we can move this conversation.
I mean, it's very interesting. A few things I'll say here. One is that, so your conception of the priest who kind of knows better that there isn't any value, but then who tricks the people into believing that there is value, is kind of remarkably Platonist in the sense that it's a noble lie that we tell the people. How is it not that?
It's Zoroastrian. Zoroaster is 1500 years before Plato. Nothing to do with Plato whatsoever.
Okay, except that Plato says that kind of
and
thing.
And it's not the noble lie. This is the thing. If you search for truth, and you discover truth, say the recipe of an atomic bomb, and it would devastate humanity, it's your fucking job as a priest to lock it up. That's exactly what Judaism and Zoroastrianism have locked in spaces for the priesthood only. So you can contain the truth and then decide what can people hear of this? And that's exactly the beginning of universal human rights. That's the beginning of the diversity of opinion. That it starts with the priest realizing the priest and the people must live in different worlds and have different religions. And this understanding is Zoroastrian, fundamentally Persian. It's the Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great. It's the beginning of Judaism. I always insist that the West starts with a Persian Hebrew axis, and the Greeks are incredibly overrated. I'm not a Platonist.
Mark, I think you have to put on the microphone if you want to say something.
I'll pass. Sorry, I'll pass to Zak for a second, but just to say because Zak was in the middle of a thought stream, so Zak will finish his thought stream, and then Alexander, with your permission, I want to come back to hit some of these issues directly. But just to be clear, right, in terms of scholarship, right, in other words, the Persian Jewish axis is not an axis, right? In other words, as Lieberman wrote very correctly, much of the Jewish priesthood is a critique of Zoroastrianism, right, and taking issue with the way that the Zoroastrian priesthood emerged, right, and actually the Jewish priesthood, right, would rile at the notion, right, which appears in Plato in the way Zak described it, or versions of it, right, that the priest's role is to fool the people, right, in the ways that you described, right, because that creates basically a priesthood whose function is deception, right. Right, and that's a certain kind of world we're describing, right? A priesthood whose function is deception, right, begins to create the kind of world that B.F. Skinner envisioned, upon which techno-feudalism is built, right? So I find that a very, very, very problematic notion, right? A priesthood whose job is deception, right? A priesthood's job is, in the Hebraic notion, right, is to actually align people with their own intrinsic realization, right, of structures of value that live in them and in cosmos together, right, because we live in a participatory universe. But let me just bracket that for a second. So I just wanted to make the Zoroastro kind of Hebrew notion pass back to Zak, and then I'm gonna go to death, right, with permission.
No, I'd like to hear Alexander actually respond directly to that, because he seemed to be shaking his head quite vigorously. Because it sounded like specifically you said the priests were supposed to be deceptive.
Wait, okay, I'll explain. Number one, the Jews critique everything, including themselves, at all times. It's their favorite hobby. It's Jewish navel-gazing. So
a cheap, non-intellectual shot, which has no credence. Funny, sweet, but no credence.
Okay.
None.
My experience is that Jews understand Zoroastrianism slightly better than others, but be prepared. Zoroastrianism is the most misunderstood philosophy ever. And it's our peril that we don't even understand the origin of the West, because it starts in Persia. So Cyrus the Great sponsored the building of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. It's undeniable. He's the only Messiah is not Jewish in Jewish religion. And the same way the Jews are treated with enormous respect in Zoroastrianism. And the current tragedy of the Middle East is the conflict between Iran and Israel, when Iran and Israel should be the absolute allies in the Middle East. And those were historically. So we can always go back to this completely different conversation. So let's stay with Eros and Libido as much as we can.
Okay.
Right? So the question was, the deceptiveness. Wait. We live in the Western world today in a sort of post-Christian, post-Muslim world. And my problem with Islamic Christianity is this enormous belief in the cult of transparency. I think it caused the devastations we have that we are now seeing 2-year-olds watching pornography. It's precisely the cult of transparency that must be stopped. That's
Alexander, double click, just so we have a shared language space. Tell me what you say a little bit more about the cult of transparency. Just I want to make sure I understand.
So the cult of transparency starts with the Christian claim that when Christ dies on the cross, the curtain in the temple is fallen down. There's no separation between the sacred room and the most sacred room, which to Jew is an aberration. That's why the Sadducees were the ones who killed Christ. You cannot practice the Jewish religion with that matter. In the Jewish religion, there's a room that you can see into, and you can see the gold and the diamonds and the arch and everything in the sacred room. Beneath the sacred room is the most sacred room that only the high priest can enter, and only once a year.
Holy of Holies.
Yeah, hold on. This is Zoroastrianism, if anything, right? The separation is called the barred absolute, not my last name, barred, like enclosed absolute. Like, are you ready yet to walk into this realm? In Eastern culture, this is absolutely adamant. It's a difference between Sutra and Tantra. It's not about deception. It's about knowing what you can know now or may never know, because you're not the right person to know it. It's to know that there are forces out there in the world that you must not have access to because you couldn't handle them. That is Tantra versus Sutra. It's not about deception. It's like telling a child you must be indulged and watch porn when you're 2 years old. Of course not. And if you're a child and you move to adult, the children are not decepted by their parents about adult life. We just don't tell them about sexuality and things until they're ready for it. The same thing goes for adult life. In serious priesthood, it's all about caring to find out with the hardest psyches, the hardest minds are always the ones who should become priests. Like, to train yourself to early be able to understand things that other people can probably never comprehend and must never know. And then know what to tell them and when, and what maybe never to tell some people before they die. It's not about deception. It's just we got to stop this fucking cult of transparency. It's the heritage from Christianity and Islam. It's a sort of world we live in today where journalists will go to find absolutely everything about everybody. And speaking of values, the cult of transparency that we inherited from Christianity and Islam is precisely what it caused us to lose the sense of the private and the sacred in culture today. I'm a great defender of the private and the sacred as the foundation of values. But what current capitalist society, post-Christian society forces us to do is to reveal absolutely everything at all times, because there's no curtain left in the temple, and therefore the Holy of the Holies is accessible to everybody and has been degraded into nothingness, right? So the nihilism we live in today is exactly comes out of Christianity and Islam that I critique, where I defend Judaism and Zoroastrianism, by saying that the religions that understood you must have a barred absolute. Those religions are Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Those are religions that I work with and defend, because it's within those traditions I can see an understanding of the difference between Tantra and Sutra. And the fundamental Tantra is that the priest knows. Sutra is what the priest tells us to love our children and make society work. And Sutra must work before you can do Tantra. So in the same sense, the priest does this, it's not being deceptive. It's just about knowing what you know and then only tell people when actually it's to the advancement of society itself.
So this is super helpful to hear that, because and as you know, Alexander, it aligns directly with my notions of teacherly authority, right? And also, whether you like it or not, with human development, which is that there are times when people are ready for certain forms of knowledge. But what's interesting about that dynamic, and I mentioned it before, is that there are threads of continuity and discontinuity in the human psyche. And so there are truly places where priests can reside where other people can't get to. But there's a path there for most people. And so the question is about, is there continuity between what the priest holds in the full awareness of that and what the everyday person holds with their loving of their family? Or is it the case that which is to say, like the priest is articulating some kind of higher is not even the right word, some kind of deeper or more complex form of knowing, which is not in contradiction to the love of the family, but somehow a deeper justification for that love. This is the question, right? Because if it's somehow a deeper justification for that love, then it's very similar to what we're trying to describe, which is that basically like there are these fundamental things like loving of the family, right? Which are reconceived by each person over the course of their life until you get to the priesthood understanding of like, here's how you love your family, and reconceived through different social paradigmatics as they change over time. So that notion of there's a single kind of unified sense of like, Jesus, love for family is irreplaceable. You can't get behind it. You can't get away from it. It has to be there if we're going to be human, right? And yet different technologies, different education, different things change the way that value is articulated and embodied over historical time and biographical time. That's a lot like what we mean when we say evolving value, right. Basically, is that the value of the family, the value of that kind of love evolves over the course of historical time. Doesn't mean it's getting better and better and better, not at all, but it's certainly evolving in relation to technology. So there are moments in history when, like right now is one of them, where the absence of familiar love is one of the things that's destroying our civilization, and it's the result of technology running interference between families and capitalism and a bunch of other stuff. So there's an alignment there, and the esoteric exoteric kind of tantra sutra distinction and the finding a place in Judaism in particular for that, I think, is also right core to the what right. Mark and I have been working on a long time as well. So
I think that's right. In other words, that I resonate with, and this is I think our first place of alignment here, which is an important place where I think we share a language here, with a couple of qualifications before we all die in a second, right? And we'll get to death in a second. There is a Zach, Alexander, Tom, and everyone. There's a this kind of very strange contradiction in postmodernism, where it kind of asserts these two values that don't work together in any way. And one is transparency. There's this utter idolatry of transparency, this cult of transparency. So we've talked a lot about, and it was very exciting to hear. We've talked a lot about the idolatry of transparency, but we're saying something very similar. And at the same time, postmodernity kind of, has this vaunted notion of context within context within context within contexts, right? But actually, those two things contradict each other, because if I share with you a fact, right, it's almost impossible to share the nuance of the context. So the fact is therefore a lie, right? I'm basically lying to you. I've given you a fact. This is what happened, but you don't know the context. You don't know the subtlety. And some of us have experienced that, right? Where kind of facts have been shared without context. When you share fact without context, worshiping at the altar of transparency, you're lying, right? In other words, and so privacy, right, is a sacred value, and paradoxically and sweetly and beautifully, the way that we both express it, or well express it, is actually through the Holy of Holies. Holy of Holies is exactly the image, right? So we've all come, it's very beautiful, and it's very beautiful shared language here, and that distinction between Tantra and Sutra is important, and we call it in one of the lineages, right? And it's actually the term esoteric comes from, trace the etymology, the Hebrew term seter, right? And seter means that which is hidden, but it's hidden because the same word means to destroy, right? In other words, if you actually share that which should be hidden in an inappropriate way, right, when there's not, right, and actually all of the interior sciences of Hebraicism, right, revolve around what's called sod, right, which is the entry into that which is sod, that which is esoteric, right, as it should be, right? And clearly, that's a very fundamental principle, right, which is being, violated in such extremis. Literally, if I'm not transparent about it, it didn't happen. Right? There's no ontology to the event. So I think that's important. And, Zach's already spoken to, so I won't reiterate it, right? But that doesn't mean that the priest's job is deception. And deception and education are fooling, right? And as deception and education are two different things, right? And the difference is as follows, is this notion of this continuity of value. Because when we say love your family, we don't say love your family simply because it's, and I don't want to get involved in our lexicon or your lexicon, or argue what's paradigmatic value or eternal value, or what we call evolving value, because we'll spend too much time working on our lexicons, which we're probably not each familiar enough with. So let's bracket those kind of things, but that there's a continuity of value, and that what the job of the educator is is to actually evoke from within the human being that which they already have access to if they will but listen. Right? All of education is a pointing out instruction. It adds new information, and it actually provokes the human being to their own evolution and transformation, to their own, what Luria calls in the 16th century, bearer, clarification. So let's bracket that conversation. Let's go to death for a second, because we could go down that road, but I think without putting death on the table here, right, we can't actually get where we want to go. So I think, and this may be one of the places we fundamentally disagree, right, which is okay. And when we die, you'll realize you were wrong. We'll talk about it and we'll be good, right? But it's a big deal, right? In other words, if death is the final frontier, right, meaning if we meet death and it's over, right, that tells us something about the nature of reality, right? And if we meet death and death is a transition, right, and so I want to just kind of put this very, very clearly on the table, right? I have no idea what actually happens after death, right? Meaning I don't know whether it's this way or it's that way or it's that way or it's that way. Having said that, I think there are three arenas of information that tell us, right, that death is absolutely not the final frontier, right? In other words, and that is, essential. And here's the three arenas. I want to just kind of portray them for a second. The first is actually paradoxically the one that's least accessed, which is the anthro-ontological arena, right? And the anthro-ontological arena means, so I'm bracketing, let me just name the three and go to the first. The three would be empirical. So there's an enormous amount of empirical information from, let's say, in the last 130 years from, Edith and Henry, right? Sedgwick, at Cambridge, actually, who started the first cyclical society. And then they wrote a letter to William James, and he started another one at Harvard, right? And there's an enormous amount of serious literature. There's charlatanism in the literature. There's a lot of bullshit in the literature. There's a lot of crap in the literature. However, underneath that, there's a very strong body of serious literature. Zach and I were just corresponding with David Ray Griffin, who's written about it, who's kind of, I think, a really good Whiteheadian, although, we would take issue with David on any number of issues, but in this particular arena, in terms of an investigation of the literature, right, that particular literature, he's done a quite good job from a scholarly perspective, right, and looked at that empirical literature. So there's a kind of number one, there's a radical empiricism, right, of information that approaches death that's available to us in a way that it never was before, right? In other words, we've accumulated over the last 130 years an integration of cross-cultural information that's never been available to humanity before. So someone like Ian Stevens, there was never someone like Ian Stevens at University of Virginia that our colleague Michael Murphy actually funded for 30, 40 years, right? And who actually collected, 2,500 cases of reincarnation, right? For which, right, he thought rationally, Michael Murphy thought rationally, the most valid explanation would be that there's some process which is trans-death, right? So that's radical empiricism, number one. Number two, there's rigorous philosophy. So we actually have to look at, which we're obviously not going to be able to do in these minutes, we have to look at, which I'd be happy to do in another dialogue, what are the 5 arguments we have with materialism? What are the 5 arguments with dualism? And materialism is really, 19th century dualism is really 17th century materialism, right? 17th century, dualism is 19th century materialism, which just lops off the head, right? In other words, it's actually the same basic kind of thinking, right? But just it takes off the head. So there's not the head, there's no dualism, there's just materialism. But you got to look at the 5 critiques of materialism, the 5 critiques of dualism, where they fall short, where they don't. And then you realize neither of them are sufficient philosophically, right, to explain reality, right? I was, boxing with Daniel this morning. We're talking about philosophy of mind, right? And this is a philosophy of mind issue. Careful. And then you realize there's actually a third possibility. Zach and I call it pan-interiority, right? Whitehead talks about something similar but dissimilar in a lot of ways. He calls it pan-experientialism, right? But whatever, whatever version of it you're going to call, right? There's a rigorous philosophical conversation which addresses the death issue. So there's radical empiricism, one. There's a rigorous philosophical conversation that addresses the death issue. But I'm most interested in the third. But all 3 of them live together. And the third is the anthro-ontological issue, right? And the anthro-ontological issue is, right, how do I experience, right, death in my own immediate awareness, right, my own immediate unvarnished knowing. And I think there are 12 anthro-ontological doors, right? And, and you always get nervous when someone says number one. So I'm not going to do number one. I'm just going to do one of them, right? But each one of the 12 is vast and important, and each one is a chapter. And Zak and I have actually penned, most of these chapters. We're at the very end. But here's one. I'll just give you one of them, right? So let's take the notion of fairness. Okay, fairness, right? And I don't know who has kids here, who doesn't. I have 4 kids, right? And one of the things that that you have an utter fucking disaster on your hands if you don't handle it. If your kid says, that's not fair, right? And they start screaming in a particular way, right? Anything that you do that's not willing to address the fairness, right? And Zak can speak to kind of the developmental issues here, but fairness is a fundamental structure of reality. Now, we know that reality should be fair and that there's some violation when it's not fair, right? There's something, right? And I'm going to stay with this. We know that right now. We also know that reality is not fair, right? It's blatantly, obviously, right, 1 billion% not fair, right? So anyone who tells you reality is fair is clinically insane, right? So how do we put those two together? So we know, and so we've got these 2 bodies of information. We know that it should be fair. We know that we try and be fair. We know that we want to be part of this noble fairness of society. We know that fairness as a value lives in us. And we know that, in terms of history, right? In terms of history, right? Well, my relatives who were gassed, right? That wasn't fair, right? Obviously, right? Right. And so we've confronted, right? And it's hard not to, right? So we know the utter tragedy, right, of that which isn't fair. And the way that we understand, right, fairness is that we actually anthro-ontologically, right, expand, and this is the Judaic move. This is the Judaic move. It's one of the places that I believe that Judaism took issue with Zoroastrianism. Judaism and Zoroastrianism, as you probably know, were very close to each other historically. And there was a very other than you and I, and a few scholars, very few people have thought about this. So I'm actually fascinated that someone else is thinking about this. But Judaism was in direct reaction to Zoroastrianism. And actually, much of liturgy was written as a hidden, implicit dialectic with Zoroastrianism. And there's a very, very private body of literature. It's esoteric in the sense no one notices it, but it's a quite important body of literature which we can talk about at a different time. But so Judaism's understanding is, or Hebraicism's understanding is that actually our intuition of fairness is not wrong. It's not a mistake, right? It's not a social construction of reality, right? As our colleague Yuval Harari would say, kind of parroting postmodernism, where he says the difference between Libya's Gaddafi, right, and universal human rights, no real difference between them. They're both fictions, figments of our imagination, and social constructions of reality. They're just basically nonsense, right? But let's impose them by the priesthood on society anyways, because we'll control society, which again sounds very suspicious, is like Skinner, right, in Walden 2, right, who basically says there is no intrinsic fairness, there is no intrinsic value. And Skinner, as you might know, was one of the founders, right, of what we later called techno-feudalism. He was one of the early figures, right? And actually people like Pentland, and Zak and I are writing on this now, the analogy between Skinner and Pentland. Pentland's actually a student of Skinner. Pentland is the MIT Media Labs, right? Who's one of the key architects, right, of what you would call an autocracy and we would call techno-feudalism. So the knowing that fairness is an intrinsic value tells me that it's not over when it's over. It actually gives me information, right? It's actually gnosis. It's actually anthro-ontological gnosis, right? I actually know, and I'm going to make that claim clearly. I actually know in my body, right? As sure as I know that I'm talking to, as sure as I know that this is a table, right? I have 100% uncertainty about how it looks. And I have 100% certainty, right? Other than my atheism, right? Which is that actually there's a, right? And my atheism means there's a place where I've got to suspend that knowledge and act in this world as if this world was the only place that exists, right? So as I've got to bracket it sometimes to act in this world, says Nachman of Breslov. He says, divinity creates atheism, right, in order to allow us to act in this world. And without the possibility of atheism, we would never act as we should in this world. So I've got to actually anthro-ontologically receive atheism, even as I receive in the very same moment the utter ontological correlate of fairness, which tells me, wow, it's not over when it's over. But actually that when my aunt, great aunt, walks to the gas chamber with her child in her hands, that's actually not the end of the story. And the Nazis actually don't win that day. That actually there's a larger story, and there's the fabric, right, of a larger story, and that's part of the structure of reality. So that actually the storyline of reality doesn't end at death. So let me just kind of put those three on the table, right? I'm sure we disagree about this quite radically, but it's beyond an important conversation.
What I don't get, Mark, so just because you know doesn't mean there's utter blackness.
Say again, Tom, I apologize.
Just because you know about some intrinsic values and fairness and all of that, it doesn't mean that it's over, or it doesn't mean that it's going on,
Well, no, the other side, right? In other words, what I know is, right, it's like first person gnosis, right? My first person gnosis tells me that it's not utter blackness, but that there is what I might call continuity of consciousness, right? That, right?
No, sure, I get that, but that doesn't mean...
No, but it doesn't mean what? I'm sorry, I might have missed what you said. Tell me again, I apologize. Give it to me again.
No, I mean, just because you know and you have perceptions about this and insights doesn't mean that you know about the nature of consciousness after death.
No, so let me be very, very precise, right? Let me be very precise. It's very important, right? So again, what I have radical uncertainty about is how it all plays out, right? And anyone who tells you they know how it all plays out, you might as well just stop talking to them, right? So that's one, right? But we can have, right, a lived experience, right, of a kind of core certainty of being, right, is that it's not over when it's over, right? That actually there is a continuity of consciousness. And that knowing of the continuity of consciousness is actually very real. And again, there's about 12 major ways. There's 12 doors into this knowing, which I'm obviously not going to do now in 1 minute, but we've thought about this deeply. There's 12 major anthro-ontological doors. By anthro-ontological, I mean the mysteries are within us. We can actually access that inside our own clarified gnosis, right? And so I think that there's a very popular notion these days. Maria Popova, right, propounds it. Sam Harris propounds it. There's popular notion that, wow, blackness. And if you don't take death seriously, you don't realize that, there's this kind of almost this cult, right, which claims that, we know that it's over at death, right? I think that's nonsense. I think we actually have first person interior knowing, right, through the eye of value. And I want to talk about the eye of value is a much bigger conversation what that is, but we have direct access, right, to that knowing, right, through these 12 anthro-ontological doors. And I just tried to open just to crack one of the 12 doors, which is fairness, right, which is obviously what we all agree is that fairness is not available within the context of a lifetime, right, for an enormous amount of humanity. So like that.
Can we get back to death?
Let's get back to death.
Yeah.
Let's dive into death.
So I think the lecture you just gave was a perfect example of sutra. Makes sense to a lot of people. Involves quite a lot of wishful thinking, but it's a good story to hear, and it can make people love their children. The tantra of death is that death is the absolute. You die when you die, period, right? So that means when I started studying the Middle East and Middle Eastern history, which is the origin of Western culture, it was so striking. The Persia and Egypt were so radically different during the Bronze Age. The Egyptians eventually spent their entire fortunes on building huge pyramids. And Egypt was so drenched in mummies. When the British Empire ran Egypt in the 19th century, it used mummies for feeding locomotives because they didn't have enough coal in Egypt. So they used mummies, right? So this obsession with the afterlife was fascinating me. And I always point out that Plato was the Egyptian Greek, Heraclitus was the Zoroastrian or Iranian Greek. And then when you study ancient Persia,
we agree on that.
Yeah, when somebody died in ancient Persia, you threw their corpse as animal feed. You didn't do pyramids. It's striking. It's so striking that culture survived for 2,200 years in empire, and the Egyptian empire basically lasted 6 years during Akhenaten and then fell apart completely, because that's when it went absolutely absurdly into pyramid building, right? So where did these ideas come from? I think it's much more interesting to say, why do we escape death the way we do? I agree with Hegel on that one radically. And Catalast and I are writing a book about this at the moment called The Negatology. So it's either because you believe that everything is processed and returned to the same, And then you foster reincarnation as the sutric solution to that. It's the good story to tell the little boys and girls, right? That everything is reincarnated. Also keeps a caste system in place. It's perfect for a feudal society, right? And then, of course, the other heritage came out of Egypt, and that's the belief in the afterlife. And Judaism did not believe in the afterlife originally. It was introduced later in Judaism, especially through Greek philosophy. And therefore, the Christianity took on the idea of the afterlife, and Islam then started using the same thing. This is the cheap price you pay. Like, you want people to work hard 6 days a week for an aristocratic lord or master, and therefore you teach them in church or in a mosque once a week to stay working 6 days a week so they can get to go to heaven when they die. That's where the idea of the afterlife comes from. It's a really stinking history. The afterlife is not a good idea at all. It doesn't help people at all to be loving their family or stay within the tribe, to be honest about it. But when I discovered with the Persians, what the Persians that practice 2 ideas. The first one is Haurvatat. Haurvatat is the idea that if you're lucky, you will live a long, full life. If you're lucky. If you manage to live a long, full life, you will die with a sense of completion or a sense of wholeness. That's Haurvatat. Then there is Ameritat. Ameritat is that which transcends you. You die, but you're a minor figure. Tribe is central. Community is central. You're just a servant of the community. I'm not an American. I don't believe in individualism. It's an American religion. Always remember that. It never really hit it in Europe, and I'm not an individualist at all. I believe in the social. I believe that human beings are flock animals. The only individuals I ever met were polar bears, not human beings, right? So when you go back to what it means to die, it's that you die, you then pass on children, heritage, whatever you achieved in your life, that others can take over for you. And therefore, Zoroastrians do not go to a funeral place where they see a buried body because they gave the body and sent it off as animal feed. No, the Zoroastrians will celebrate the day you died, not the day you were born. They will celebrate the day you died for the next 70 years every year, and it's called the Polgasar. And the Polgasar means you celebrate the memory of that person while that memory still has intrinsic value to the tribe, where that person, having lived a full life, Harvatat, completed Harvatat, therefore can be a role model and a forefather or a foremother to the tribe. And this is what I mean with death is the absolute. I think it's integrated into tribal structure, and it's perfectly possible to have a society that doesn't preach the afterlife or reincarnation, because I think those ideas are ridiculous.
Right. So I mean, Zak's going to step in, and I want to stand up and say one thing. Just, well, you know what, Zak, you're in the order. Let me hold our holy order here before I jump in. Right.
I'm like hesitant to jump in. Obviously this will not be resolved here. I mean, a few things occur to me. One is that clearly there's a way that ideologies of the afterlife serve the kind of function that Alexander is describing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Like
100%. We all agree on that.
I completely agree with that. And to use the pre-tragic, tragic, post-tragic, you're looking at pre-tragic visions of the afterlife, with basically tell you, you're all set. You're going to heaven to be basically like it is here. It'll just be better for you. And it allows you to avoid the actual tragedy of death. It allows you to avoid staring at the fact that Zak is done. Zak doesn't go on forever, right? And my understanding of those traditions that have written a lot about reincarnation in the most sophisticated ways basically say the same thing. They're like, if you think that this is about you, Zak, going on, you are fooling yourself, that you die. But something, not you, continues. And this is what you're saying, Alexander. Like, something continues. How do we ontologize that thing that continues is an interesting question. Robert J. Lifton, who was one of the first psychologists to deal with the issue of existential risk, he interviewed survivors of Hiroshima, which is just crazy to think about, interviewing people who survived Hiroshima. He devised this concept of symbolic immortality, which is a lot of what you're describing, Alexander, which is that basically like the human being doesn't function without symbolic immortality, that the human being needs a story and a set of practices that assures them that something goes on. The question is, how does that psychological need for symbolic immortality, how is that met by the priestly caste? And do they parasite on that? Do they basically use that as a way in for propaganda and kind of like control? Or is the need for symbolic immortality, when correctly kind of kind of harnessed and taught into, it becomes the thing that allows people to have right action, right? Like in Zoroastrianism, I would assume, because you know they're going to be celebrating the day of your death for 70 years, kind of makes you want to do the right thing, so that for 70 years they're not just remembering this guy's an asshole. And so much of what the function of the ideologies around reincarnation are that. And again, even Kant, like the great or not great Kant, he's like, you can't get morality without having some sense that there's more. And again, that notion of, again, the evolving value, that there's some value in symbolic immortality, that the human psyche doesn't function well in a context where there's no access to symbolic immortality, which is one way to describe, I would say, postmodernism, which is one of the reasons they're all going insane in the face of existential risk instead of rising to the occasion, because we actually can't grapple with the absence of symbolic immortality. But that need for symbolic immortality creates a vacuum into which crazy amounts of bullshit can go. So I think we're agreeing on that. And I guess the final thing I would say is just a simple philosophical point, which is that, like, I'm hesitant of anyone who throws down hard on either side of this debate, basically. Like,
let me then rephrase that and say there's enormous positivity involved in death as the absolute. So, for example, we do ecstatology, and you probably are really skilled, both of you, in tantric practices. So that's like tantric sexual practices. That also today involves tantric psychedelic practices. Another perfect example of the difference between sutra and tantra is that psychotherapy is sutric and psychoanalysis is tantric. Psychoanalysis starts with the words, there is no big other. You kill God, the first thing you do. They're typically tantric, right? So I would say with sex, drugs, and psychoanalysis, contemporary society, we need to practice them in a tantric manner. So going to the experience called the infinite now. The infinite now is the ultimate ecstatic experience you can have as a human being, hopefully shared with some other people. It can be deeply religious experience through meditation and contemplation. It can certainly be psychedelic, it's probably the shortest route to it. It can be through sexual practices, which is Eros. And once you go to the infinite now, it's called the infinite now as the contradiction. That's the whole point, right? The infinite contradictions work wonderfully when you go into mythos and try to describe what something can be described as in language, because it can obviously not be described in language, since it's pure ecstasy. But the nature of the infinite now, when you know you reached it, is that it's absolutely wonderful to be in that state. But if you would stay in that state forever, it would be pure horror. And then you learn how to come down from the experience. Yeah. And you learn how to memorize the experience. And that's learning to live with death as the absolute, in my philosophy. So that's why we worked a lot on ecstatology. So we also have the positive sides of what does it mean to be a mortal human being, and what are the enormous benefits of being truly mortal and to live as immortal. And at least that's what I do philosophically speaking. So the infinite now is the positive consequences of accepting death as the absolute.
I think the infinite now is clearly a place we can meet, right? I mean, it's, in other words, and Wittgenstein, that's what he was talking about when he talked about, he had that sense of but let's go back a couple of steps. So just in passing, this is not where I want to go, right? A couple of times, right, we've identified, or Alexander, you've talked about Eros and sexuality in the same sentence. So I want to just bracket that, in other words, that's not how we think of Eros, right? The sexual models the erotic, doesn't exhaust the erotic, and there are 12 billion years of Eros before there's any sex. So we should have a great conversation about Eros and sexuality. So let's bracket that conversation just for clarification of terms, just because we passed it by. But now, to the more essential thing, three things. And I think that, I'm beginning to see ways in which our languages are quite different, but there actually are shared overlapping intuitions in a number of levels, which actually I didn't anticipate, right? And as I thought was more sharp, right? And it also is sharp. There also are very, very sharp distinctions, and they need to be articulated. So I'm gonna stay with permission and mad love on the sharp distinction side for a second, right? So number one, I have met individuation in many other places than polar bears, with all mad respect for polar bears, who I love madly, and animals in general, right? Love madly, right? Tom, for example, is pretty individual, right? In other words, the notion of individuation, right, is a very, very important notion, and it's not a coincidence. And of course, the individual and the social, I'll use your term, the social, or allurement and autonomy, or attraction and repulsion, or autonomy and communion, however you want to tell that story, are clearly two poles that both have ontology. And the notion of individuation, when we actually go inside, right, our experience, right, is this notion of immortality. Now, by immortality, I don't mean, let me go slow, I don't mean Zak as Zak with that, slightly anarchist beard, kind of is going to kind of be, he's going to reappear the next time. That's obviously not what we're saying, right? That's obviously, we're all not saying that. But we're also not saying, and I want to hear kind of clarify and not blur the distinctions for the sake of politeness, because that's not helpful here. We're going for gnosis, not politeness, love, not politeness, right? So in other words, the sense, right, as Zak, you pointed to, that without a larger field of value, which is beyond the frame of one lifetime, right, the human being can't function. And that was a very, very important sense. That's an important developmental sense. It's an important psychological sense. Now, what we're saying is the fact, now you can provide that through the social, right? You can provide that through the 70 years, right? Now there's ways to provide that, which I believe are fundamentally inadequate in the ways you describe them. And paradoxically, you took a Zoroastrian set of notions, interpolated them with some other ideas, then presented that, right, as a sutra, right, but actually claimed, right, that it was a tantra, right? And this is the cryptonormative thing that Zak's pointing to, right? And you're making very, very sweeping claims, right, which I think an enormous amount of anthropological data, right, that lives, in virtually every human being actually goes against. And let me just kind of point to this. In other words, the fact that we have a need, right, for a larger frame of value beyond this lifetime, right, so that you got to ask something about the nature of need. And what's the nature of need? Because that's an important word there, right, by itself, right? So a need, right, and what the relationship between needs and desires is, we should do a dialogue on how needs and desires relate to each other. But as consciousness deepens, right, in the eternal now, needs and desires actually turn out to be ontically identical, right? And it's only when we're unclarified, right, that needs and desires seem to be vastly different than each other. But needs and desires actually come together as we clarify consciousness, and let's use the word eternal now, right, in that space. But we have a need, and that need, for example, let me take it back to fairness. That need actually tells me that my great aunt and her baby, right, will they reappear as my great aunt and her baby? I have no information on that. Right? And so, Tom, that's where we're together. I have no information on that, right? But do I have a kind of interior first-person clarity based on the eye of the heart and the eye of value, which are part of radically empirical information, and based on 12 anthro-ontological doors, right? And based on a rigorous reading of philosophy, aka, for example, David Ray Griffin, and aka radical empiricism. That's a lot of information, right? But let me go back to the first person now, that actually there is a continuity of consciousness and here I'm gonna avoid being cute, because there's a tendency, right? But not to Zachary Stein as he is right now, but to some quality of Zakness, whatever that quality is, some taste, some configuration, right, that actually, right, continues, right? And I think the notion of karma, which is a complex notion, so there's a lot to say about it. Our friend who's at the think tank, the scholar practitioner Sally Kempton, right, has actually written, extensively and taught extensively about it. But the notion of karma, with all of its fallacies, and it's got a lot of fallacies, and you're absolutely right in pointing to all the ways it can be hijacked. And Voltaire was right when he said, "Remember the cruelties." Right? In other words, we know the great fallacies and great sins, right, of the pathological versions and how they were adopted, and Foucault was right? And in the ways that things were co-opted for power. Having said that, the intrinsic knowing, right, that reality, right, as it lives in us, as my little son knows, and my daughter knew, and my other two sons know, no, actually, Daddy, it's got to be fair, right? This can't happen unfairly. Right? We need to actually know that there's an intrinsic fairness here, and the scream when it's not fair, right, is a cross-cultural developmental scream in terms of the data. Right? There's a cross-cultural scream right? When there's a violation of fairness that's actually speaking to something essential. Now, what's considered fair, right, in the surface structures of society, right, has been a great conversation. Can we get to a place, which is maybe our next conversation, where there's a shared grammar of value, a shared grammar of evolving value as a context for diversity, right? Not a totalitarian value, not an imposed value of Walden 2, in which planners behind the scenes are actually pulling the string, right? And a kind of, complete, desiccation of what human identity could be, which some people are holding up in their writing as this great new emergence, but actually violates everything that we feel intrinsically is important about being a human being, where we have these kind of upgraded algorithms and downgraded human beings, right? So let's bracket that for a second, but that there is a notion of fairness, that notion points to something real, that it's an intrinsic and ontic value of cosmos, that it's an evolving value, right? All of that is utterly critical, right? And without all of that, I don't think that any of the other appeals to kind of contrived immortalities actually speak to the need of the human being. Like the human being needs to know, but that need is disclosing an ontology, right? It's not you can't reduce it to a psychoanalytic need, right? It's disclosing an ontology itself. And so that feels, that feels quite important. And maybe the last sentence is, right? Uniqueness is a core structure of reality, right? Uniqueness is a core plotline of reality, right? To take uniqueness and shunt it off to the side, right, is extremely problematic, and I believe violates a vast amount of data in literature, right, which is just ignored, right? Uniqueness is a core central structure of reality, and the evolution of uniqueness, right, is a core data of reality. But by uniqueness, we don't mean separateness. We mean, right, kind of a kind of individuation that works within the context of the larger social and the larger biological and the larger cosmic field. An individuation of the field. We, as you know, call it unique self or evolutionary unique self. That's our name for it. But uniqueness is critical. And so uniqueness is part of the immortality conversation, right? Uniqueness is part of the ethical conversation, right? It's a key part of all pieces. And I think it's very, very important not to caricature the pre-tragic moves, right? Right? What we all agree is we can't avoid the tragic. And I think that's what we're all kind of saying, but the question is, do we remain in the tragic or do we get to the post-tragic? And what does it take to get to the post-tragic? And I think we're all trying to get to the post-tragic, but the differences here are vast. And so, yes, there's things which we share, which are very, very important intuitions, but we don't want to paper over. These are very, very, very important distinctions that we need to hold, and we need to hold them with a kind of openness, and maybe the last sentence, when I cited Nachman before, Nachman of Breslov was kind of one of Kafka's favorite, thinkers. So, and Nachman speaks so beautifully about the embrace of radical atheism, right? You've got this Hasidic master, right? 3rd century after the Baal Shem Tov, who's talking about you've got to embrace the void, and he then rejects 200 years of intense Loranic scholarship that says that the void's only epistemological. And Nachman says, no, let's say it's ontological, right? No, fuck that, right? Let's go into the ontology of it. He embraces it, and then comes through it, right? And so I think we can meet in the embrace of the void, right? But then we come through the void through the eye of value, right? And the eye of value is evident in the intrinsic value of this conversation right here, right now.
Okay.
Right. And Alexander, I'm so sorry. I want to open up the conversation right now because we talked now for 90 minutes.
Oh, we talked for 90 minutes already?
Yes. Unless you can do your statement within, let's say, like a minute. But then, I would like to open up to some questions.
The problem here with fairness is just like immortality. It's a naive concept. I think it's important here to read René Girard and his fantastic work on violence of the sacred and to understand mimetic desire. And actually, there's nothing nice to the desire for fairness at all about it. The fact you want to make something fair is to make something work better in the social environment. And I referred that back to the tribe. So within the tribe, you sort of decide what's fair between the members of the tribe. And there's a great word for a single human being that I use in my work. It's the individual. I never, ever use the word individuals because I never met an individual in my life. But I meet a lot of individuals, byproducts of the tribal context where they were born.
Okay, well.
Okay, so if there's anybody who has a question, please raise your hand and ask your question.
Hmm.
You can write it down in the chat box.
Terry has a question. Terry Nelson.
Hey, could we just speak? You know, as my son Topher has grown up, my wife and I joke about his entire life. He's now 24, but he's always had absolute confidence with no basis in reality. So, and so my question is about the priesthood and I guess in some ways parenthood. Who gets to decide when I tell or when the priest tells Topher the secret and important information? How does one qualify to be the priest that gets to decide that gets to disclose what people can handle? And I know if I told, as I have told Topher, well, when you're older, you'll get it, or when you're older, I'll tell you, he's quite incensed with that comment from me as the parent or the priest. And now at my age, when you say, well, the priest will decide when you'll know enough, I get quite irritated and I go, tell me now, I know now. Don't give me that bullshit about you're going to decide. So how do you, who gets to decide who the priest is? How do you know when it's time for people to know, much less, you know, what it is they ought to know and when? So
that was a multi-billion-dollar question. Okay, I would say living in Northern Europe at the moment, which is probably the most secularized culture in history, is exactly where I'm lacking strong religious communities where I live, right? I think governments are terrible at telling people when to do what in their lives or advising them on those things. They basically just throw them out there in their loneliness. I think we're lacking in our culture today are strong religious communities where it's a lot easier to handle these things. And for young women to come to me and have all kinds of problems with their lives, they feel that they're living in a delusional life. I always tell them to go and see an older woman for advice. When young men come to me and they live in a very delusional life and they discover that, so they're ready to listen, I tell them to go to an older man. That's what patriarchy and matriarchy are. Beautiful words, by the way. We should reinstate patriarchy and matriarchy against the postmodernists, because those are the words we're looking here. And of course, there can also be experts. And as I pointed out here today, this is why we make a difference between psychotherapy and psychoanalysis. Psychotherapy is deeply sutric and it makes your life work. The psychotherapist's job is to fix you and get you back into life again and make your life work. Whereas the psychoanalyst is somebody you can see where you're not in an acute situation at all, but you're so damn curious about things, you really want to know how things actually operate. And that's why psychoanalysis, which is the Jewish practice from the beginning, begins and ends with the insight, oh God, I wish I didn't know this. And then the psychoanalyst says, well, now you do. And now you have to live with it. You were curious, right? So this is what I mean with the Tantra and the Sutras, that you know you're in the Tantric when you're constantly reminded that, oh God, I wish I'd never known this. But I asked for it and now I have to live with it. The genius out model, I got to live with that. Whereas the Sutric, which is just to fix this 23-year-old man's life, is something that a religious community should be good at by sending in older men or older women to advise him.
Zach, you want to pick that up a little bit?
I mean, there's a lot of ways to answer that. There's the anthropology of how has this been done, which is to say what have been the practices by which priests are selected and according to which, you know, novices are kind of graduated to different levels in the religious hierarchy and those kinds of things. So there's many answers to that have been out there. But I think Alexander's point is actually a good one and a misunderstanding of development in general. Not that Alexander misunderstood it, that most people misunderstand development, which is that you want to go up this thing, right? You actually don't. Like if you are in the sense that you don't, in the sense of like, if you want pleasure and peace and all the things that are, you know, coveted by our mammalian brainstem, going up this thing is actually treacherous and frightening and a huge responsibility, like unbelievable responsibility to go become a member of the priest like caste. And, you know, there's kind of a way in which there's a bait and switch in a lot of traditions where they kind of get you in with some excitement, like in Buddhism and everything. You're going to attain enlightenment or whatever. And then when you realize it, and Trungpa said, enlightenment is your worst disappointment. And that's what he's kind of saying is like, you think you want to have this ecstatic, mind-blowing experience. And in one sense you do, because it's a deeper connection to reality and there's all these things, but in another sense, you really don't. And this is true of any dynamic of teacherly authority for the most part, which is that you're transmitting knowledge, you're bringing someone up to your level, but you're also empowering them or kind of obliging them to a certain level of responsibility and power. And so that is something we misunderstand, and it's one of the reasons people get so confused when they graduate from school and things, because there's like this huge celebration as if it's all good. And the other side of this equation is that, now you have to do a bunch of stuff you didn't have to do before, and a lot of it's going to suck, right? Like, so I think that dialectic of development is very important to see, that it's not simply growth to goodness. And therefore, when you are in an educational relationship, one of the first things you need to be honest with students about is where you think you want to go. Like, do you really want to go up here? Because when you're up here, there's all this responsibility. So there's a self-selecting process, I believe, in the so-called priesthood. And again, like if you look back into anthropology, it's like all the meta-modern 20-year-olds want to be shamans and stuff. But back in the day, you didn't really want to be a shaman because it meant that you were being basically destroyed, like repeatedly, and exiled from the community in a strange way where you're kind of related to it and with distance. And so that's another example of that same thing where we're misunderstood. What do you really want to be a shaman? Let me show you what that actually means. Are you ready for that? And so I think that notion of self-selection becomes important with the priest class, and then discernment on the part of teacher and student about who's ready for what. Outside of institutional context, it becomes very tricky. It's one of the reasons we built institutions the way we did, was to handle precisely these problems. And now all of these non-institutionalized forms of teacherly authority are complex to navigate. So it is $1 million question, or $1 billion, whatever it was. Yeah.
Let's take the other side of it, right?
Because I think we have more questions, Mark. Can I just
address this side of that last piece? Is that okay? And is that okay, Tom?
Sure.
Just one more thing on just this thing, because I think it's really important, right? In other words, there are two desires that live in a person, right? There are, there's a phrase, in the interior sciences called Paltrin Shel Melech, which means you don't want to live in the palace of the king, right? Because the palace of the king demands a lot from you. You'd actually rather be, in the hinterland, someplace where you can kind of do the shit you want. So that's one dimension of a human being. And there's another dimension of a human being which yearns to be royalty, right? Which has this enormous desire to experience, it's why, whenever you look around, when people walk out of a Superman or a superhero movie, they're doing whatever the superhero did, right? In other words, that superhero-ness lives inside of us. So there's really two dimensions that are both important, both educationally and structurally in a human being, right? And that is, so the teacher, and I'm using the word teacher instead of priest, but the teacher has to actually evoke, right, the intrinsic desire that lives in a person, right, and call it to the next place. But here's the big however, right, which is the however is, if only the teacher knows the truth, meaning the teacher is limited to the sutra. Let's borrow your phrase, Alexander, but in other words, we're not sharing the tantra, and there's not a continuity between the sutra and the tantra, right? Then we begin to create, right, all of the false gurus, right, that actually we all agree, right, are problematic, right? In other words, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in the last 12 years, let me just use the kind of, we talk about a 5-part model of self, and we talk about the move from, pre-personal to separate self to false self to true self to unique self to evolutionary unique self and unique self symphony, and how that model works. But bracket that for a second. Let's say true self is the kind of classical enlightenment position. The problem with that position is the teacher always claims to have more true self than the student, and then claims an inappropriate authority, right? right? Because the teacher's got access to the Tantra and the student's stuck in the Sutra. But actually, both the teacher and the student, right, have intrinsic access, right, to the Tantra itself or to intrinsic value itself, right? And therefore, the teacher is therefore evoking, right, something which actually exists in the student as opposed to socially constructing it, which would create a kind of totalitarianism. So that's really, really important in terms of the parent, right? The parent and child, there's a hierarchy. Hierarchy is a very important word which we need to reintroduce. It's gotten, inappropriately thrown out, but the hierarchy is within a shared field of value. And that's critical to any kind of education that we need to establish. So we don't want to err too side on the other side. We got to hold that dialectic. Tom, thank you for letting me jump in there.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Mark. Roman, do you want to ask your question? So is he there?
And Roman had a great earlier question in the chat box, but
yeah, exactly. So the question is if he wants to ask that directly.
I'm happy to respond to the chat box question, and I'm sure we all
so just someone read the question aloud.
Yeah. You want to read that?
So he said, maybe I missed it, but how do you make sure that such a fairness notion does not lead to justification of pure evil? That is, I can kill you now because given endless lifetimes, it will become fair for a reason that will be known at this future point of time, when you have no continuity of the exact identity. I think that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I saw the question, earlier. It's this. We'll leave out the second half. Okay, Tom, I'm with you on that. But so this is very, very important, right? In other words, any notion, right, can be used to justify anything, but there's an intrinsic nature of the notion itself. So, right, it's obviously anthro-ontologically absurd, and the word anthro-ontology here is very important, to suggest, right, as for example, this is one of the great horrors of Christianity, right, was that Christianity was actually claiming to act in, right, for the sake of fairness, right, or even, very, very tragic notions in Kashmir Shaivism. As beautiful as Abhinavagupta was, and he was in certain metaphysical ways, right, the Hindu notions of karma were also tragically used, as you alluded to, Alexander, right, in terms of justifying, the horrors, and, and everyone kind of apothesizes India. India is a fucking horror, right? Now, they're on multiple levels, right, for all the reasons, right, of these kind of justifications that actually remain in the space. So clearly, right, when you try and take fairness and then say, I have access, right, to priestly knowledge that no one else here has, and I know your previous incarnation, and therefore I'm going to crucify you, we should shoot that, right? That has no space. We're talking about fairness, which is, and that's where the context of one lifetime is critical. And this is where Nachman's atheism is critical. And this is where Hegel's dialectic is critical. And we got to live in both places together, right? There is, in other words, Soloveitchik, right, was a great thinker. And I remember him when I was like 13 years old. I would sneak into his lectures and he would say, without a dialectic, nothing. And we just end there. And of course we need a dialectic, right? And the dialectic is radical atheism, right, and radical value. Radical atheism meaning it's got to be in the context of this world, right? And anthro-ontologically, this is what Nachman is saying, anthro-ontologically atheism is a value. Because you have that moment when you experience it profoundly, right? You experience it, he calls it the void, right? He calls it the void. And there's in esoteric circles, maybe 500 people in this particular esoteric circle around the world, there's something which we call, among us, we call it Torah 64. And Torah 64 is code for Nachman's hidden essay on the void, where he destroys Luria and ontologizes the void. And you're like, right? You read it, right? It's Torah 64. So and I think that's what you were pointing to, Zach, when if you come down too far on either certainty, right? It's Nachman saying, no, let's ontologize the void for a second, right? We got to take that seriously so that we don't allow for fairness positions, right, that make a kind of Hindu claim to multiple lifetimes, et cetera, right? Fairness has got to be immediate and available, Alexander, in your phrase, in the context of the tribe, right? And again, this is where we're now coming, here towards the end, towards the places where these shared notions, and I'm now kind of, in my body moving in a different direction toward, okay, what are the pieces that we each have that can be woven together, right, in a kind of larger vision that can be, mutually fructifying. So in that sense, the immediacy of the tribe, right, is unbelievably important. But, I'm talking about the tribe more as a universal tribe. I mean, there's a local tribe, which is an intimate local language, but there's also a universal tribe, right? And there's a way to have a universal tribe and to have the 150 of the Dunbar number at the same time. We can actually hold that dialectic. And one of my favorite parts of this conversation was, right, you described, although you said it's 40,000 years old, but you described kind of the ontology of, family, 40, 150. But actually, here's the funny thing, right? The postmodernists are not wrong that all of reality is a social construction of reality, right? Just like they're not wrong when we say God's a figment of our imagination. God's, of course, a figment of our imagination. But our imagination's a figment of God, right? In other words, that's the thing, right? In other words, right? Our imagination's a figment of God, right? Whatever, the God you don't believe in doesn't exist. Take that as a given. So the social construction of reality is, right, the structure of value of infinity invested in finitude, right, as intrinsic value that's unfolding. So this disclosure of the familial, right, and of the 40 and of the 150, right? These are all important disclosures. And I think that's what we share here. And so that's just in response to the fairness question. And Alexander, Zak, please.
I can just add that it's quite easy these days, and we see sort of the woke resentment culture. It starts with the difference between being heroic and being resentful. And fairness, like any ideal, it can certainly be used for all the wrong reasons. And I would say today, it's quite obvious that if we live in a society where the overall value is to arrive at an equality of opportunity, that's a shared sense of fairness, right? But when we start going towards an equality of outcome, we go into pure terror. That was the case with the Jacobins during the French Revolution, the Trotskyites during Marxism, etc. So we know that, we've learned that for the past 20 years. It's a very tough lesson to learn. But the lesson learned here is that we go towards the equality of outcome, we go towards pure terror. And that's when fairness is no longer about fairness at all. It's about nothing but the most banal, bloodiest form of rivalry.
Completely agreed. And I think we're
the general lesson is, and this is a lesson about propaganda, you actually know an idea is important to the human psyche when, like fairness, for example, when it can be used as like fuel for,
right,
basically for propaganda. Like if fairness wasn't actually important, then you couldn't plug into fairness as a propagandist to get people riled up into resentful mobs. And but again, this is where the evolution or development, metamorphosis of the conception of fairness in the individual really matters. Because if you're John Rawls, and forgive bringing Rawls into this conversation, he would be blushing right now if he knew that he was in this conversation. but to bring Rawls in, his conception of fairness would not allow. Just by that definition, he's most concerned about the least well off. So you're not going to turn into a terror type situation. Right. If you stay true to that highest conception of fairness. But if you downward assimilate fairness to the playground, then tyrants running around claiming, seeking fairness for everybody. So it's subtle, but it's again one of those things: love, fairness, beauty, justice. All of these things are incredibly important concepts, but we don't have all of those terms and have been put into kind of an information warfare space. Because it's almost impossible to use those terms, right. Like fairness and justice, for example. I wrote my first book, Social Justice and Educational Measurement. About a year and a half later, the social justice kind of movement started, and I was like, oh my God. Like, I wish I didn't have that in the title of my book, because the way they're using it is so antithetical to the way I'm using it.
So you're the culprit or what?
Exactly. But it showed me like, oh geez, like all of our most precious terms and all of our most subtle psychological buttons that can be pushed because of the importance of these concepts, they become the matter upon which the manipulative, work us over. So it's just worth noting. So these reactions, well, isn't fairness could be used that way? And it's like, yeah, totally can. But that's why it's so important that we start talking about it.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Tom, there's another question there. I don't know if you want to take it. Which is about existential risk. What might be a way to, I see just right above Roman. You see right above Roman there? How does this conversation relate to existential risk and the future of humanity?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe we could each talk about it, because as we're closing here. So maybe I'll turn to Alexander or Zach. I'll definitely want to address it as well. But Zach just spoke, and then I did before. So fairness, right? Alexander, right? Turning to you. Oh, can't hear you. Okay, so then I'll be happy to pick it up and
yeah, please do, Mark. Yeah,
please, total sweetheart, right? And I think that's, and again, let me propose a sentence which has a lot of footnotes to it, right, in multiple disciplines, but let me propose it as a sentence. And as a sentence, one of the things that we've worked on is just simple structures that have enormous amount of data behind them, but are actually, you can actually access something like pre-tragic, tragic, and post-tragic. That's that kind of structure. So let's talk about another structure, which would be, let's say, innocence, guilty, second innocence. And here's another structure, which would be kind of first simplicity, complexity, second simplicity. So let me talk now in the language specifically of second simplicity, meaning understanding there's complexity here and that we're not going to cover it all in 1 minute, but let me just kind of access second simplicity, if you will, right? So evolution is love in response to need, right? Evolution is love in response to need, right? And that's a very, very important idea, meaning need, and I alluded to it before, and it requires an entire dialogue, but need is an anthro-ontological disclosure of the way things are. So when we have a need for an experience of the field of immortality, right? When we have a need, right, of fairness, right? All of those things can be hijacked inappropriately, right? As Zach pointed towards, but the fact that they can be hijacked inappropriately shouldn't tell us that they're not real. It should tell us that they are real, and we have to actually guard them, right, very carefully, right? And part of that guarding is what I would call the job of the teacherly or of the priestly class, right? Is precisely, right, to prevent, right, their hijacking, right, through good thinking, through good feeling, right, etc. And there is a hierarchy of thinking and feeling, right, obviously. So in that sense, Graves, for example, as a developmentalist, wasn't wrong when he talked about new life conditions. New life conditions are actually disclosures. Cook, right, talks about new life conditions as a matrix of revelation. So in this moment of, existential and catastrophic risk, and all of us, right, are aware of the meta crisis, right, and we'll use that term just as short term, right, and the meta crisis has informed, right, our thinking and our feeling in very serious ways, right? And we're willing to borrow from Robert J. Lifton, who Zach invoked, to not turn away, right, to face in towards. So with that in mind, right, and I'll just give an example of it, right? There's a gentleman who's a good writer who's actually, critiqued, many things that deserved critiquing, right? Jorge Ferrer, right, who wrote his doctorate at CIS. You guys probably come across his thought. He's talked about, the participatory world, and he worked very hard in any number of essays at kind of destroying any notion of intrinsic value because of this postmodern fear of kind of this totalizing and this oppression, right, that would come from it. And those were all legitimate and important, right? However, he got so lost in the desire to prevent there from being any narrative, any storyline at all, because it might have been hijacked in a kind of Foucault sense for the sake of, power abuse, right? He actually left us with a world, right, in his thinking, and I spoke to him about this, in which actually there's no narrative of all, and when there's no narrative of all, when there's no shared ground of value, right, then you create a kind of nihilism which will be hijacked in far worse ways than anything else, or at least equally bad ways. And so I tried to point out to Jorge, it's a good example, right, how in 6 or 7 or 8 places in his thought, he was actually cryptonormative. He was actually assuming value, actually throughout his thinking, right? But actually every time he assumed value, he would hide it, right, and deny it. And he wrote me back, he said, actually I'm right. He spent his life critiquing perennial philosophy. He wrote me back, actually, I'm a crypto-perennialist, right? And it was a fascinating exchange. Here's the person who kind of had taken a stand against perennialism, and had critiqued perennialism in all the valid ways you could. He was the most serious postmodern critic of perennialism, but it turned out he's a crypto-perennialist, right? He's actually standing for value. And so at this moment of existential risk, where all of our challenges are global, and we require global coordination, which requires global coherence, right? We need to actually create global intimacy, right? On a tribal level, a kind of tribal global intimacy. And intimacy is only generated by some sort of shared story of value, right? Not a totalitarian story, not an imposed story, right? A shared story of value, which is a context for our diversity, right? A context for our tribalism, but there's an overarching context of intrinsic value that allows the conversation to take place. And in that sense, right, all of our work is a direct response, right, to the context of the meta crisis, or if you will, to borrow Manfred Harris's term, we can't solve the meta crisis just on the level of infrastructure or on the level of social structure. We need to actually engage in, right, in the superstructure, right, which is the worldview, right, the story, but not just the story of value. So that's just Krista Joseph who asked that question, just a beginning conversation as we're towards ending.
Yeah, Zach, Alexander, you want to shortly respond or contribute to that?
Yeah, did Roman have some further questions? Because that was Roman's question originally, right?
That was Krista's right above.
No,
Okay,
we finished this up.
I don't even know which question we're answering right now.
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused.
That was the existential risk question. It was right above Roman there, I think.
Okay, the existential risk question. Yeah, it's a big issue these days. I would say the big existential risk is called the atomic bomb. And we live in the atomic bomb age since August 6, 1945. It's still an underrated issue. I know climate risks, it looks like it's more easier to handle for people, maybe because it's more sutric. Climate change will cause enormous destruction, enormous costs, but it's not an existential risk. Humanity will not go down because of climate change. But the atomic bombs are out there. If Iran gets one in the next few months, very likely, then certainly all of the Middle East will have atomic bombs within the next 5 years. I'm terrified of what we'll do with the bomb. I'm okay if human beings one day create a machine that surpasses us in capacity or whatever. I'm fine with that if that happens one day. But let's at least build the technology that kills us, that earned its place as the replacement of humanity, and not kill us with the bomb.
Right, Zach, last words?
I will not attempt to summarize this conversation. I mean, I guess, yeah, the issues of existential risk kind of loom over any conversation these days. And the point Mark was getting to there was basically that although X risk seems like a technological problem, and in some ways it is, X risk is actually a psychological or cultural problem that can only be resolved through innovations in the level of superstructure or the imaginary power, if you will, the ability to craft worldview, story, and to bring, to weave the sutra of the masses, essentially, if you can say it like that. That the whole thing is a vast decision-making crisis. It's a vast crisis of education and learning. And so, although it seems like we're in a situation where the scientists need to save us, they will at some point, but the scientists can't tell us why we should be saved, which is to say the scientists can't speak to the fundamental questions of value that we've been trying to speak to today, right? They run on the assumption of value, even though from the podium they might dismiss the entire cosmos as valueless, and they still go home and love their families, right? So this question of how to, as Mark said, articulate some evolving shared grammar of value that can allow us to actually speak into X risk together as a species. It seems wildly ambitious, and yet it's completely necessary. Something like that is completely necessary. So that's where I'll leave it.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you all for joining. I feel that, or I hope that this is a beginning of future conversations, because, there's, at least to my understanding, a lot to be sorted out and future conversations. So I hope you keep it going, either here or wherever you guys meet. So thank you all. Thank you, folks, for joining and listening.
Great conversation.
Yes. Take care.